This episode features discussions and interviews around sensitive topics that may not be suitable for all listeners.
Domestic violence is probably one of the most despicable crimes because it's committed against someone who loves and trusts the offender. It happens in your home, and it often leaves victims controlled, confined, and cut off. In this episode, we're looking at how domestic abuse affects male victims. Welcome to the Problem with Men podcast.
The Problem with Men podcast.
See what the jury and judge think. Tell the world, Johnny. Tell them, Johnny Depp. Johnny Depp, man, I'm a victim too of domestic violence, and yes. It's a fair fight. And see how many people believe or side with you.
While opinions on the trial between Johnny Depp and Amber Heard were divisive, some of the evidence shone a light behind the closed door of an abusive relationship.
And I watched you lie, and then
I didn't punch you, by the way. I'm sorry that I didn't hit you across the face in a proper slap, but I was hitting you. It was not punching you. Babe, you're not punched.
Don't tell me what it feels like to be punched.
You know, you've been in a lot of fights, you've been around a long time. I know. Yeah.
No, when you fucking have a close
You didn't get punched. You got hit. I'm sorry I hit you like this, but I did not punch you. I did not fucking deck you. I fucking was hitting you. I don't know what the motion of my actual hand was, but you're fine. I did not hurt you. I did not punch you. I was hitting you.
Evidence such as this highlights how abusers try and control the narrative. It also highlighted how men too can be the victim of physical violence in a relationship. Most, if not all, relationships have tensions, disagreements and arguments. But when does this turn into domestic abuse?
Well, the official definition, which the government use and we use, is where there is a single or a pattern of abuse, ranging from psychological and emotional abuse, economic abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse, and coercive and controlling behaviour between adults, either that they're within a family or that they're also are partners or former partners. And that's the government's official definition, and it's one that we and the whole domestic abuse sector uses.
Mark Brooks is the chairman of the Mankind Initiative, a domestic abuse charity that focuses on male victims.
But underlying the definition of domestic abuse is, for the first time, we've got a domestic abuse law. Domestic Abuse Act is the official title, and it was came out last year. And what that's really important in doing is actually putting the definition of domestic abuse in law, because before it wasn't a legally defined term. It was obviously used, but it wasn't legally defined, and now it is. And so I think that's a big advantage. In addition to that, the government have recently just published statutory guidance on the delivery of the Domestic Abuse Act, and that obviously will give a lot of teeth and understanding to the types of behaviours that make up domestic abuse.
So while it's good that the government are tackling domestic abuse, do we know how many men might be victims?
So the Office for National Statistics, which is the independent statistical body in the UK, estimates that around 750,000 men are victims of domestic abuse every year, and they make up 1 in 3 of all victims. And also they state that between 1 in 6 and 1 in 7 men will be a victim in their lifetime. So it's a substantial figure, and the key for us is not to get into debates about whether it's slightly more or slightly less, because we think that that's a good estimate, and we want to focus on the policy and also on the delivery of services in the communities for men.
Ben Hine is a professor of applied psychology at the University of West London. He teaches and researches topics relating to gender and forensic psychology. A lot of his academic research has been around domestic abuse.
So one of the issues within this area is that we're often guided by statistics, which is absolutely right to an extent. So what I mean by that is that statistics can only get us so far, and they should always be presented with critical insight. So, for example, some people look to police recording as a reliable measure of the proportion of victims. Now, we, from those statistics, see that approximately 80% of those who report to police are female and 20% are male. So people say, okay, 1 in 5 victims are then fundamentally male. Now, there's no specific issue with using those statistics as long as they're presented with the caveat that men have widely reported that they do not want to engage with the police, when they are talking about domestic violence. And there is a wealth of research that suggests that they don't have great experiences, although this is now, over 5 years old, so things may have changed. So my point there is that may represent an underreporting by men to police services, and therefore to say, well, fundamentally 1 in 5 victims are therefore men from that data could come under question, and I would certainly question it. Same with the Office of National Statistics data that says it's about 1 in 3. We always have to ask, okay, how is that data collected? What kind of questions are asked? And what you find is that the more kind of neutral you phrase the questions, the more the more widespread and community-based the sampling is, actually the closer we get to 50-50 and gender parity of abuse.
The more you think about it, the more sense it makes. Why wouldn't women be just as abusive as men?
So if you're not evoking these ideas of abuse and violence, which we might associate with one gender over the other because of the stereotypes, when you strip all of that back and you deliver measures that are more neutral and focused on behavior, then we see parity. And I have always been in the position of being very clear that there is no reason to think that one gender should be more abusive than the other in terms of the capability. Everybody is capable of being abusive.
But aren't men supposedly just more aggressive and abusive?
It's less about whether you're a man and you want control or whether you're a woman. It's about what latent or life course trauma do you have that has led you to a propensity of violence. And I think it's really important that we start to open up our minds to the idea of female violence, the idea that women can be aggressive and violent, because I think colloquially, many of us know that, we know that women can be perfectly capable of violence. Why wouldn't they be? But it's clouded by these stereotypes around what it means to be a man or a woman, and whether women on the whole are violent, that kind of clouds that judgment. So I think we need to make quite a few inroads here on really wanting to understand. And that's the thing. We've got to have the motivation as a community to understand why people are abusive, and then to try and help them in that, regardless of whether they are male or female, or particular sexuality or so on and so forth. So I think we really need to open ourselves up to developing that understanding, because at the moment we actually have an exceptionally narrow view of domestic violence and abuse, why it occurs and what we should do about it, which is focused almost exclusively on the experiences of cisgendered and heterosexual women, which are completely valid, deserve our attention, but not our complete attention.
As a society, we do seem to have an issue with seeing women as capable of violence. But why is this? Mark Brooks again.
It's been a running theme for the last 15 years, which I've been involved in this field, where organisations and campaigners who just cannot accept or wish to minimise to the smallest margin possible, they cannot accept that women commit domestic abuse against men. So every year or so, you'll suddenly see organisations and campaigners wheedling out information saying, well, when it comes to male victims, majority are men committing domestic abuse against other men, which is just completely untrue. And, you know, those who put out that type of meme or type of trope really are doing it because they cannot accept that women commit domestic abuse against men. It's very disingenuous, and I've been very public about that. Their motivations are quite clear because they take an ideological view of domestic abuse, which is primarily female victim, male perpetrator, and therefore it makes it difficult for them when they're looking at their ideology to accept that men are victims at the hands of women.
But it maybe goes deeper than that. Ben Hine.
Well, our response and our understanding of domestic abuse or domestic violence and abuse, or otherwise known as intimate partner violence, has grown out of much needed and very effective feminist approaches to violence that have rightly sought to centre, understand, and improve the experiences of women who've experienced violence from their male partners. And those approaches, as I've said, were really needed. They've raised great awareness. They have led to the development of various services and support in the community. However, what has occurred as a result of that is that the narrative around domestic violence, particularly from a feminist perspective, which frames abuse as kind of unilaterally perpetrated by men towards women, has ended up excluding many other types of survivor from the narrative. This has been in effect at multiple different levels, right from policy and provision and the kind of violence against women and girls strategy, the Istanbul Convention at the top, all the way down to, service provision and also survivors' interpretation of the behaviour that has been perpetrated towards them. So, our advocacy and our awareness around domestic violence has grown from a completely valid place. However, that narrative has led to the kind of invisibilization of certain survivor groups.
So clearly, campaigners on behalf of female victims of domestic abuse have been successful in raising awareness of the issue. They've influenced policy and secured support for victims. But their success might have come somewhat at the cost of male victims. Mark Brooks.
Well, the key thing is that when it comes to abuse, first of all, it's about the power and control of one individual over the other. So that's the key driver, and so that's important to have that at the front of your mind. But also, it's not always about physical violence. I mean, and this is why the definition of domestic abuse is really important, because obviously physical violence is captured within that definition, but issues around coercive control, economic abuse, psychological and emotional abuse, and also the use of children and other aspects of domestic abuse are really captured in this. And therefore, for many men, when they're growing up, they're told, obviously, that it's not really likely that they're going to be a victim of domestic abuse. And also, when it comes to when they are a victim, they often don't understand they are. And also, if they do understand it, they feel a real sense of shame and embarrassment. They feel less of a man. It undermines their sense of what it means to be a man, that they're not strong, they're not individual, they're not a provider or a protector. And also, one of the other issues is around physical size difference, because for men, generally speaking, of course, you're 6'2", when we get called as to our helpline like this, they're 6'2", The woman in their life who's carrying out the abuse is 5'6", for example, and it makes that far more difficult for them to actually get their head around the fact that they could be a victim. The other point on this is that it's really important for organisations and the public, because we all have a duty to look after each other, to help men put the jigsaw together or put the equation together. So what we find is that men recognise the abusive behaviours, and they obviously recognise that they're wrong. So they get the first part of the equation, the two, and then they got the other part of the equation that these behaviours are wrong. So the other part of the two, but they then don't finish the equation and think, right, that's domestic abuse. So what we need to do is help men put the rest of that equation together, because domestic abuse is quite a technical term. It's not one that men are brought up or socialised to think could actually happen to them. So therefore, when it does happen to them, they have trouble actually understanding it and also processing it, which can lead to this enhanced sense of shame, fear and embarrassment.
So I moved overseas for work post-university. There was a bar that a lot of the sort of expat community would go to, and she was there with a friend, and we got talking, and it kind of went from there, really. So there was a kind of period of almost, kind of love bombing. It's very intense, very positive, very, encouraging, very supportive, very enthusiastic about, going and doing things together and being out and about. And as I say, that coupled with being in a foreign country and that sense of novelty and excitement, it was quite an intoxicating kind of mix, I guess.
James, who asked that we change his name for this podcast, is someone who has experienced domestic abuse firsthand. He met his ex-wife while travelling overseas.
It's very difficult. I mean, because when you start talking to people about your experiences, one of the common questions I think is at what point did you realise it wasn't right? And it's really, really hard, even with, as I say, the benefit of hindsight, to go back and pick a moment where, as I say, those red flags, those alarm bells started to ring. And I think that's because everything is so incremental. And you're also in those early stages so clouded by that kind of, as I say, that newness, that excitement, that positivity and almost naivety of youth, I guess, relative youth. There was very clearly a temper there. There were very rapid changes of mood, and some quite extreme behaviour. But I think, when you're trying to make a relationship work, you're very forgiving of things like that. Unfortunately,
the relationship turned abusive quite early on.
A common theme throughout really was that I was all, and I don't think I'm alone in this, but there would always be an excuse or a reason, I guess, for the behaviour, and that, and we're not talking necessarily just in terms of, a specific incident, but in terms of patterns of behaviour, So when we lived overseas, it was around this sense that as a kind of passionate, outspoken, strong-minded female, that the society wasn't accommodating of her, and that that created a pressure on her to behave in a certain way that didn't sit comfortably, and therefore when we moved back to the UK that would be less of an issue. But when we moved back to the UK, we initially had to move quite a long way away from where my family and friends were, because of the need to find work essentially after a few years overseas. So then it was about the fact that they cut off from that network of support, family and friends, and then we moved to be closer to them, and it was continuing, and then it was about, perhaps not having an independent friendship network, but then that was no longer an issue, and the behaviour was still carrying on, and then it was about, not perhaps having found work, and then lo and behold find work, but the behaviour continues.
James's partner exploited and aggravated any insecurities he had.
I've often thought about why perhaps I allowed myself to be subject to those behaviours. And I think when as I say, you're being presented with a compelling, feasible narrative around why that person's behaving that way, but when it's also then sort of reinforced by a kind of a joint narrative, effectively, that you somehow deserve that behaviour, if that makes sense. So I've often reflected on as I say, on why I allowed the behaviours to go on, and why I allowed myself to be subject to what I was subject to. And I think it's because it, in a sense, it validated feelings that I had about myself. I had fairly low self-worth, and when somebody's telling you that, yes, actually you're not, you aren't worth much, and you are all the sort of negative things that maybe you've thought about yourself anyway, again, it just reinforces a narrative that perhaps you've told yourself over a period, so that therefore you've got these kind of two really, as I say, quite compelling narratives. One, there are reasons for this behaviour, but two, anything that's questionable, or perhaps that I don't actually deserve any better, and that becomes quite a toxic mix, I think, and you start to accept and tolerate things that very obviously aren't appropriate.
Because parts of the abuse were quite subtle, it affected James's ability to understand what was happening to him.
There were periods when we're living overseas where I would notice that things would get worse at night, and that would be manifested in kind of sleep deprivation. She wouldn't allow me to get into bed, or she'd take away all of my bed covers and pillow and deny me any kind of opportunity to sleep, because when a temper and behaviour was escalating like that, one of my sort of strategies for dealing with it was to take myself off to bed, to try and almost seek refuge in sleep, I guess. And she would not want that. She would want to provoke an argument, or want to prolong, almost the sense that there was a desire there to as I say, to provoke an argument, to have some kind of fight, which it's just not in my temperament or nature. I just don't believe that that's a healthy way to behave, and I would rather, in that instance, as I say, take myself off to bed. But your sort of benchmark, your gauge for what's acceptable and normal, it becomes so completely skewed.
As the relationship progressed, the abuse got worse.
Too long after we got back to the UK, she fell pregnant with our first child, and certainly the behaviours as in the early months and years of my daughter's life were very extreme and challenging, to the degree that she, at one point she was diagnosed with postnatal depression, and it was a helpful label, because although I knew that these were not behaviours that were unique to that period, having a kind of medical diagnosis that removed any sense of personal agency from it was helpful in a way, because it gave it a label, and it gave us something to, I guess, work on and get help around. But some of the worst incidents happened during I would say my daughter's sort of first year. The behaviour became much more extreme, much more violent. It was happening in front of my daughter. To the extent, one occasion I was being pushed and shoved around our apartment, and my daughter was clinging to my leg, and I was almost pushed onto her. So I would say it got progressively worse from there, and I think the difficulty then is, as is often the case with relationships like that, you're effectively adding layers and layers to the relationship. First house, children, financial responsibilities. It becomes harder and harder to see an exit from that, and you become more and more, I guess, determined to try and make it work for the family. The narrative becomes about that need for children to have a healthy, stable, two-parent family environment in which to grow up. That's what I'd had, and that's what I certainly wanted for my children.
While James was clearly unhappy with his partner's behaviour, they always seem to find some way of justifying it. It's clearly not helped when professionals, including the ones that diagnose his partner with postnatal depression, add validity to those excuses. Mark Brooks.
But the issue is around this, what I call professional curiosity. And that if you've got a man who's anxious, who's depressed, who might have bruises in the GP surgery, does the GP think, I wonder if this man's a victim of domestic abuse, I might want to explore what's going on at home. Same in terms of the police, when they're presented with a man, they're not always thinking, could this be domestic abuse? Find an injured man, and they their reaction will be, it's probably another man that's done it in a fight. So I think there still is a long way to go when it comes to dealing with professional curiosity, and part of it is society's view that men can bear more risk and harm than women. And certainly there's been tests, including with local magistrates, where presented with the same scenarios, local magistrates felt that a man could bear more risk and harm than a woman in the same situation. So these are quite in-depth social type issues that occur right across the whole field of men and boys' well-being, from suicide through to domestic abuse and sexual abuse, and all different sorts of areas. But also we can certainly see that and how it comes out with response to how other people view male victims.
This lack of professional curiosity is just one barrier male victims have to overcome to get help and support. Ben Hine.
Whenever I talk about barriers to engagement in support, I tend to talk about it in an intersectional way, and in a way that allows us to kind of layer up those barriers, not only based on your kind of demographic, but also where those barriers exist. So just briefly, if you think about any survivor of domestic violence, they will have a barrier to reporting their abuse because there is stigma around domestic violence. Now, if you then say that person is a man, they will probably experience additional barriers than, for example, a cisgendered heterosexual woman, because they will have barriers relating to masculine norms, potential embarrassment, shame, lack of awareness of their own experiences and from services. And then if you were then to introduce other layers of vulnerability in that sense of barriers, so if that was a transgender man or a GBT man, they would have additional barriers associated with homophobia or biphobia or transphobia, and the kind of societal, rejection of anything that falls out of a kind of heteronormative relationship. So there are multiple barriers in terms of, the identity of the person seeking support. And then in terms of where those barriers exist, it starts with the survivor themselves. A lot of these stereotypes and barriers are internalized. So a lot of the time, the first step is actually recognizing that what you're experiencing is abuse, because our perceptions of gender and our perceptions of stereotypes and roles around gender will affect how we evaluate things. And just to give one example, I did a study once with a student who gave the exact same scenario to two groups of people. One was a man who was texting his girlfriend on a night out, constantly asking where she was, being very controlling, which the students identified as controlling behavior. Whereas when we switched those sexes around and we had a woman doing that to a man, it was just seen as kind of being under the thumb, a bit tongue in cheek. So our actual perceptions of behaviour can change based on our knowledge of stereotypes of men and women and how they should act. So a lot of the barriers are internal, and that's what I found from some of my research, looking at when men call helplines, for example. A lot of the support they need is actually just recognition and talking through whether what they are experiencing constitutes abuse. And then beyond that, in terms of societal, we could have judgments from friends and family that are potentially negative based on violation of norms and stereotypes. There is a chronic lack of availability and then successful service provision for men. So services are often at fault there as well. And also when we look at justice systems, so for example, interaction with police, there is a body of research also demonstrating that male victims of IPV do not have a good time with the police on the whole either. So that essentially adds up to a picture where men face, significant barriers. And then when we think about that intersectionality, if it was a GBT man who was also from an ethnic minority, those layers of barriers just end up compounding.
And of course, it's harder to see yourself as a victim when male victims are often hidden.
It's an issue of representation. If you don't see yourself represented as part of a phenomenon, then you are going to fundamentally question whether you are indeed experiencing that phenomenon. So the other example that you'll often come across is if you go into a GP surgery or even a nightclub toilet, for example, you might see posters, that are targeting survivors of domestic violence, saying, it doesn't have to be this way, you can leave, here is the support for that. And almost always those are, yes, targeted at women. So it creates this overall narrative that this phenomenon, these behaviours, this experience is exclusive to women, and that will then reinforce the lack of awareness and the barriers that men feel.
This issue of representation doesn't only affect victims, it also influences police officers, GPs and other professionals who, like Mark pointed out, are less likely to spot when a man is being abused. This is exactly the situation James found himself in.
My daughter would be just over a year old, where, and it was the occasion I talked about where I was almost pushed onto it, where she went on to physically attack me, and that had built up over a period of weeks. So by that point, my arms were covered in a number of sort of bruises and scratches and welts, and that on that day she had a really severe escalation of temper and anger, and as I say, pushed and shoved me around, screamed and shouted at me, eventually physically forced me out of our apartment and locked the door, and threatened to return overseas with our daughter. And on that occasion, I did ring the GP to get some help. And again, from that perspective of, look, this is happening to me, but I want to try and find a way of dealing with it together. And I was able to persuade her to come to the doctors with me. So we went to the doctors that afternoon. It was a Saturday afternoon. We went with my daughter as well. And, I talked. So the referral had been very much around, I'm experiencing violent behaviour, I'm being assaulted, I need some help. So that was very clearly the direction of the referral. We got to the GP, we talked about the fact that, I had been attacked, I had bruises and marks on my arms. That I wanted us to try and find some support. And the GP's position was that essentially he said that there are sometimes people have grown up in cultural circumstances or family circumstances in which, there is violence and there's aggressive behaviour, and that conditions people to perhaps model those behaviours later in life, and that there are cultural factors, and that some relationships are therefore just a bit, there's a bit more push and pull, shall we say, in the relationship. They're a bit more physical. But that essentially, I should just get on with it,
And of course, it's not just professionals. One aspect of abuse is how the perpetrator will often isolate the victim from their support networks. Mark Brooks.
And many men, when they talk to us, describe the fact that they feel like they're the frog in the slowly boiling saucepan, or others describe it as they're going through this circle of, loving relationship. There's some sort of tension. They become isolated from friends and family. They work out what's going on. They try to escape, and then there's a ramping up of the abuse that they suffer from. Often that's when physical violence comes in as a way of the perpetrator to try and reassert her control. But the key thing is, for all victims, is that there's no one single type of abuse that they will be suffering from. They will be suffering from a whole cocktail of different types of abuse. But also, you get the situation and where the other key barrier, and there's 4 key barriers that men face, but as well as what I call masculinity, and there's nothing negative about masculinity, but how men are socialised, how men are, it's either in their DNA or how they're socialised into thinking in this provider-protector role, hence why they feel this enhanced sense of shame. But one of the other barriers that male victims face is around how society believes how men should feel, act, do, and think. And when it comes to domestic abuse, the public generally, and also many professionals in public services, not all, but many, don't have the same level of spidey sense that they have potentially for a female victim. So if there's a brother or a son that's got a new girlfriend or partner, for example, and they're less in contact, they don't start necessarily to think, is my son or my brother in an abusive relationship or a bad relationship? And as that contact becomes denuded and gets less and less, their spidey sense isn't going off in the same way it probably would for a female victim.
The core issue is how society understands domestic abuse.
Yeah, as a society, domestic abuse is still recognised as a woman's issue, but that's not really in keeping with how society is. And in fact, when you say it's a woman's issue, it's only seen as a heterosexual woman's issue, because women in same-sex relationships are completely marginalised and underrepresented in the narrative around domestic abuse too. And the concern we have is that it's really out of keeping with how this century, and in particular this decade, is trying to make great strides when it comes to recognising diversity, inclusion and equality, and a recognition that we live in a 360-degree world now, which is right and proper. But for some reason, domestic abuse is decades behind that. And partly that's because there's big lobby groups, interest groups, and others who want to define domestic abuse as an ideological crime, that it's part of women's place in the world, part of the patriarchy, etc. And by doing so, it means that there's an additional barrier to actually recognising the full range and diversity of all victims. Many try and set up this false competition between men and women, so which we don't think should exist, and certainly I don't think should exist, and doesn't exist in any other sector or many other sectors, but it does in domestic abuse. For example, many view domestic abuse as a gendered crime, which is an ideological position and not borne by fact, because to call something a gendered crime means that it only happens to one gender as a victim and another gender as a perpetrator. But also, when we've challenged this, government and others have said, well, it's because there's more female victims than male victims. So we've then said, well, there's far more men who are sleeping rough on our streets than women. Around 85% of people who sleep rough on our streets are men. So do we now say that rough sleeping is a gendered homeless problem? The same with suicide. 3/4 of people who take their own life are men. So now do we say suicide is a gendered mental health problem? No, we don't, and we shouldn't do. But when it comes to domestic abuse, it is okay to actually say that because 66% of victims are women, then that must be a gendered crime.
Ben Hine.
One of the key areas where this is an issue currently, and we're in kind of dialogue around this with the Home Office, is around where men are positioned within the various strategies. And at the moment, we do have the relatively absurd position where men are classified as victims of violence against women and girls because they exist within the VAUG strategy. There is no separate strategy for men. Now, that is fundamentally illogical and also will serve as a fundamental kind of undermining of the male experience, because they will start from a position fundamentally where, you know, they belong to a strategy that's designed for women and girls.
Mark Brooks.
Now, I know many people won't believe me when it comes to the fact that male victims of domestic abuse are officially defined and classed by the government as being victims of violence against women and girls. So if you are a male victim of domestic abuse with 2 daughters, if you are a male victim of sexual violence, if you're a gay man fleeing a forced marriage, if you're a boy who's being who's being groomed online, you are officially classed by the government as being a victim of violence against women and girls. There is wholesale misgendering of male victims of all of those types of crimes. And it's just completely Orwellian and unacceptable. I mean, from a factual point of view, that a male victim of domestic abuse cannot be a victim of violence against a woman. And the reason is because men aren't women. But according to the government in this field, a male victim is a woman. In addition, that type of narrative means it's harder for men to see themselves as being victims of domestic abuse when the narrative is all around women and girls. But also, it means that public services continue just to focus on heterosexual female victims because they're always being told we've got to deal with and address violence against women and girls, which of course is really, really important, but they're lumping all domestic abuse services under that umbrella. And what we're seeing is that local authorities and police and others are forgetting that the term violence against women and girls actually includes men and boys too. I mean, it's a ridiculous situation. I mean, you go to any member of the public and say that male victim of domestic abuse is classed as by the government as being a victim of violence against women and girls, and they just look at you incredulously, because it is incredulous. And lots of organisations are trying to campaign for the government to stop that, not to end the violence against women and girls strategy or any focus on violence against women and girls, but also to treat men in their own right, so they're victims of intimate violence against men and boys, and to have our own strategy.
It does feel pretty degrading and dismissive to hear that male victims are only valued enough to be tacked onto a strategy to help women and girls. Ben Hine.
The issue is that document fundamentally will never be in a position to truly help men who are survivors of domestic violence and abuse. And the reason for that is because that is not its purpose. Its purpose is to help and put a framework around how we assist women who are victims of violence against women and girls, as is named in the strategy. What we would need is a parallel strategy, and it's no good just providing position statements that are within that framework. Because you have to think about how fundamentally invalidating it is to come forward as a male survivor, and this is in regard to any behaviour covered by VORG. So, for example, when there was the big revelation and the scandal around boys being abused in sport, every single one of those boys was categorised as a victim of violence against women and girls, which again is illogical. So we need to come to a position where we recognise what documents are there, what they are intending to do, what their purpose is, and who they serve. And I've never been an advocate of getting rid of VORG. I think it's an incredibly useful document, but we're trying to fit a square peg in a round hole. And because of the predominance of VORG and the lack of a parallel strategy, it bleeds over into all of these policy decisions, service provision decisions, funding decisions, which fundamentally frames intimate partner violence and domestic violence in an incorrect way. And I think it's also really important now to talk about the VORG strategy in relation to the approach it comes from as well, because again, it has been fueled and it has been born out of feminist perspectives around where IPV comes from. Now, we are at a position within the academic research and the academic literature which strongly challenges patriarchal explanations of violence within relationships as an all-encompassing and all-explanatory theory.
And of course, it's not just the lack of strategy aimed at preventing violence against men and boys, but also the whole way society sees men and masculinity.
When we think about the kind of societal response, we have to think about the society that we live in. It's a heavily gendered society. We are having more and more critical conversations around gender identity as we are living kind of firmly in the age of wokeness and talking about these things, which is a good thing in my opinion. However, we're still in a society where these stereotypes exist. They are pervasive. They're representative within our media. And I always show a clip from the TV series Friends, because there is an episode of that show where Joey who, you know, as watchers of the show will know, he's quite a big, tough, very stereotypically masculine guy. He has a very short, very small, very petite girlfriend who punches him and kind of in a what she perceives as a jolly way, and it actually ends up hurting him.
Hey everyone, this is Katie.
Hi.
Hello,
Hi.
Katie. So you ready to go?
Yeah, I just gotta run to the bathroom.
Oh, sure, right back there.
Hey, where are we going to lunch?
Well, I was thinking maybe Chinese food.
Oh, I love Chinese! How'd you know I love Chinese?
She is so cute. You could fit her right in your little pocket.
I don't know. I mean, I like her a lot, and she's really nice, but...
But what?
She keeps punching me.
In the cute little sweet way she just did?
Hey, it's a lot harder than it looks, okay? She's hurting me.
Ross, I know what you need. You need a bodyguard. Hey, Ross, what is Ben doing after preschool?
Okay, listen, come on. Joey is having a problem. There's a little girl who's beating him up.
Oh, Joey, come here, look. Honey, I know this must be really, really difficult for you. And I'm sorry, am I hurting you?
Until one of them gets punched by the same woman and realizes, oh, okay, it does hurt. So, yes, the barriers exist for the men themselves, but also, yes, it takes longer time, if ever, for friends, family, co-workers, neighbors to recognize these behaviors when they are occurring towards men. And even if they observe them, they may interpret them differently because they may just think that it's a bit of fun or that it's something that men should expect or that they'll be able to deal with it rather than the reaction that they would potentially give a woman who was receiving the same behaviors where they would say, okay, we need to sort this out immediately.
If you're enjoying this podcast, support our work by leaving a rating or review on your favourite podcast app. The Problem with Men podcast.
One of the common questions received by male victims of domestic abuse is, why don't you just fight back? But this flies in the face of a lifetime of being taught that under no circumstances should a man hit a woman. Here's James again.
No, it just never occurred, and I have had friends ask, or people say, well, I just wouldn't have tolerated it. I would have hit back. It's just not in my character. I just don't. I just don't agree with violence. I don't. I grew up in a very stable, loving family environment. I had good friendships, amazing friends who've stuck by me through, and over the past few years have been absolutely incredible. I just don't. I absolutely abhor physical violence. I think it speaks of a loss of control, and I don't. For me, that just wasn't an option. I don't. I would be as bad if you respond like that. I would rather have just do what I did effectively, which was just to take the punches and the kicks and the hits and the bites and the scratches. I would rather do that than become myself a violent person. Even if that's a response to being attacked. I'm not a physical person in that way.
Even when things got really bad in James's relationship, he struggled to see himself as a victim.
There was always a sense in which I'm an adult. I got into this relationship. What happens to me physically, or in terms of what psychologically, not that necessarily I deserve it, but that I have, I'm a consenting adult effectively. Where it became unacceptable was where it was putting my daughter and latterly our children at risk. And that was very clearly the case when she was barricaded. My daughter was barricaded in an apartment with somebody who was screaming, throwing things, shouting, and not in control of their temper at all. That's not a safe environment for a child. So that I think was the driver behind, okay, I need to do something about this now, which was approach the GP. As I say, unfortunately, the way that played out was that it didn't give me any sense that there was a way out. But fundamentally, you have that view that, I have not brought this on myself, but, I've made choices that have brought us to this place, but the children have no agency, they don't choose to be born into a situation where that's going on. They don't ever, nobody deserves it, but they are, particularly innocent in that setting. And I think that's when if there was ever a point at which it became clear that it was completely unacceptable, it was through that lens of what it was doing to the children.
While the reason he was trying to get help was for the benefit of his children, he found it quite difficult to find the support he needed.
Well, I know that following separation, my mum admitted to me that she'd been carrying the phone number for a domestic abuse helpline in her purse for some months by that point. So I think the reality had started to dawn elsewhere, even if I wouldn't necessarily have classed it as that. If you look at the pattern of my experiences, you go to the GP for help, you're told, this is just life, you need to just deal with it. They reach out to helplines for help, but you can't access that support because it's not there 24/7 in the way that it perhaps is for other people. I think there is a sense in which that message is subtly, or not so subtly, reinforced that you are this isn't something that necessarily happens to men. I think there's a an underlying fear that you won't be believed, I think, is definitely there, because, you know, even looking at it in really sort of blunt physical terms, you know, you're bigger, you know, how would that work? You know, which is much smaller. How you know, there are those kind of stereotypes that play into it. I always think we have to be very, very careful about a kind of over gendered approach to this, because I think it can detract attention from the fact that fundamentally, you know, gender doesn't necessarily matter in the experience of a victim. Victims experience similar behaviours. They experience, you know, the same fear and hurt and upset when these things happen to them. You know, I think it can cause us to lose focus on children and where they stand in these situations.
Mark Brooks is the chairman of the Mankind Initiative that operates a helpline for male victims.
Our helpline is funded, and our website is funded through public donations. So we receive money from the public, sometimes organisations, fund runs, sponsorships, or just plain donations that go towards keeping our helpline going. If somebody wanted to donate to us, if you go onto our website, mankind.org.uk, and there's a donate section there, and there's a number of ways that the public can make donations to us, obviously gift aided as well, or there's lots of ideas about how to do some fundraising, you know, sponsorships, you know, take part in marathons, etc. And lots of people do that all the time. But being funded by the public gives us a real sense of responsibility, and also a sense of pride, because it shows how much the public care about the work that we do and care about male victims.
While the helpline is a great initial resource, there's still a lack of practical help for male victims, though hopefully this is improving.
When it comes to emergency shelters, and the kind of official phrase is kind of refuge or safe houses, I mean, there isn't parity, but you wouldn't expect there to be, but given there's more female victims. But there's not kind of equity. There's not certainly not a proportion, an equal proportion with respect to the numbers of victims. And certainly when it comes to refuge and safe houses, which are dedicated domestic abuse places for men and also for women as well, there is a real issue. So across the UK, there's only around 250 places which are available for men. Most of those are available for women too. And that creates a real problem for men in terms of where and how they can escape from domestic abuse and what type of support that they will be able to get. And there's a real problem in the east of England, the southeast of England, and certainly in London with respect to that. But the government have brought in, under the new Domestic Abuse Act, a lot more measures now and expectations that local councils who are responsible for this will be providing better support for male victims when it comes to somewhere that's physically safe for them to escape to, including with children, and where they will actually get domestic abuse support where they live or in other places where they need to escape to. So things aren't great in that area, but we're hoping over the next couple of years councils will get their act together and provide far more support. We do think that councils regularly are breaching the Equality Act in that they're providing support in terms of safe accommodation and really good support for women, which of course we wouldn't, and no one wants to see any of that go. We want more of it, but they're not providing the same level of support in that type of area for male victims, and that is something that urgently needs addressing.
But James, things eventually came to a head.
I mean, it was quite a long, drawn-out set of events, but in a nutshell, it began early evening with an eruption of temper and with my wife throwing things at me and destroying part of our kitchen in the process, and behaving very, very drunk. Alcohol was a particularly a factor towards the end in the behaviours. My daughter was woken by some of the violence and went to seek help at a neighbour. It escalated over the course of that evening. So after my daughter had got help, there was a suggestion from my neighbours that, you know, of bringing in possible police support, and I said I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to. I was frightened of what that could do to the family. My view was that I wanted to try and calm things, you know, between us, and to manage the situation myself, because I'd been there before, and whilst it was extreme, it wasn't necessarily that much more extreme than we'd had on previous occasions. But the violence continued throughout the evening and then night. Was bitten and punched in the head and across the torso, and scratched, kicked, and suffered, you know, over the course of a couple of hours, a sort of torrent of verbal abuse, threats to kill me, threats to take the children away, threats to harm herself with a kitchen knife, and to then call the police and tell them that I'd done it to her. Just really extreme behaviour, to the point that a couple of hours in, the police arrived at the house. I don't know the circumstances behind them being called. I think possibly having... I don't know whether neighbours, having initially, as I say, offered that police support, had taken matters into their own hands. I'm not sure. But police arrived at the house. I exited the house immediately, and officers went in to speak to my wife, and a couple of officers remained outside the house with me to talk to me about what had happened. Now, I think it's a mark of what we've talked about in terms of what perceptions you have as a male victim about the fact that this isn't abuse, this isn't happening to you. What are people going to think? My initial reaction was they're going to make an assumption that me being considerably taller than her, that at best this is bi-directional, at worst that, you know, somehow I've instigated something. And one of the first questions the police officer asked me was, "Do you want her taken in?" And I said, "I don't. Sorry, I don't understand. I don't know what I want." It's that was so completely out of left field as far as I was concerned. I didn't know how to respond. But in the end, that wasn't a decision that sat with me anyway. One of the officers who'd gone into the house came out and said that she was in such a state that my wife would be arrested and taken to the station with immediate effect, because she was, I think, violent and aggressive with them as well. And when I said to the officers, I said, I didn't think that you would understand what had gone on. And he just looked at me and he said, we're not stupid. We attend enough of these things to see. And he said, and for seconds, just look at the state of you. Absolutely covered in bite marks, scratches, bruises. He said, it's fairly obvious what's gone on here tonight. And he said, you need to get out of this relationship. He said, it's not we can't force you to, but we've attended enough of these that if you stay in this relationship and you continue to try and make things worse, then the likelihood is that we will be back here, and the possibility is that you won't be as lucky next time. And I think, I think when I look back on that evening, I think, obviously the circumstances in which they came and made that decision almost for me precipitated me being able to make that cut. But there was a point earlier in the evening where she'd been throwing various objects at me, and she picked up a drinking glass. She was only stood a couple of meters away from me, and I had my back against a sort of patio door, and she was hefting this drinking glass in her hand, and it was a fairly heavy bottomed glass. And it was at that moment when I realised that she was seriously considering whether to throw that at me as well. And you make that instant calculation of, how close you are and what that could do to you. I think that was that perhaps, you talk about those moments of realisation that this isn't okay. And that was the point at which I genuinely thought, these threats about I'm going to kill you, I wish you dead, aren't just idle, threats. They've taken on a new significance now, and genuinely my life is at risk. And I think that was perhaps the first kind of, I guess, point at which my own safety became a guiding principle, I guess.
The positive interaction with the police that night allowed James to see his situation in a new light.
Well, she was as I say, taken away by the police, and I just made the decision that was it. The enough was enough. I couldn't expose the children to that level of danger any longer. It was beyond, it was beyond safe at that point. I could no longer see that sense of optimism that had buoyed me through the years up to that point, that, with the right help, we could make this better. We could help her. We could overcome whatever mental health issues or what have you were driving this behaviour. I just realised that it wasn't going to get better. And I absolutely, as I say, couldn't expose the children to that any longer. So it just made very clear that was it. I wasn't, that the relationship, as far as I was concerned, was over. And I started then just, I guess, that long road of recovery, and trying to suddenly rebuild a life with two small children, and and everything that came with that. But it was there was a very almost a physical sense in which at that point the severity of the assault was such that it was almost, I could literally feel a cord within me being cut. That I couldn't deal with that any longer.
It's clear we still need to do a lot more to help all victims of domestic abuse, but we should also be looking at why people become perpetrators. Ben Hine.
We have a long way to go in terms of how we conceptualize and how we seek to understand violent behavior on the part of both men and women. Each has their own issues. So with women, the issue is that we're just ignoring their existence, and that is in parallel to us ignoring male victims. And actually, we are making inroads. We are gaining awareness of male victims. But one of the key things that comes back against that is, well, they're just being abused by other men, which is nonsense, because all of the statistics that are available demonstrate that when men do report being abused, it is largely at the hands of women. And then the next argument is, well, women are just acting in self-defense. So I think we really need to open up our minds to this idea that women can be and are violent and aggressive, and that is likely rooted in trauma. Now, on the converse side of that, we also need to be having the same conversations about men. We have readily accepted that men can be violent and abusive, but we never fully ask why or want to understand why. We cast them as just horrible people. We say things like, that's just what men are like. We use these patriarchal models which suggest that they just want power and control, and that's all they're after. Actually, when you look at the data that is available, and part of the problem is there isn't enough available, but when you actually look at the data, and I've just completed a project on this, you can see that the men engaging with perpetrator programs have a huge history of trauma behind them. But as programs and as organizations and strategies and policymakers and academics, we are not asking those questions of men. Now, I don't understand why that is. Is it because we fundamentally don't care about them? Is it because we have a difficulty expressing empathy towards men, which is very common in society? Is it that if we did that, we would actually be effective at helping them, and it would dent the kind of financial prospects of programs that seek to work with perpetrators? I don't know. I'm just saying it's amazing to me that we're not asking the same questions and affording men the same richness of sympathy and empathy and inquiry that we do of women. Because with women, we're kind of seeking every explanation that we can for why they're being violent. We seek to try and excuse it as much as possible. Whereas with men, we're highly focused on just demonizing them, sitting them down, telling them that they're just horrible people and that they want control over women. A lot of this violence is rooted in emotional dysregulation, attachment-based trauma, and traumatic life course events. And we don't sit down with men and try to understand how that has affected them and how we can help them. And we should be doing that if we truly want to help female victims, but also all victims and survivors. And we need to be doing that from both angles. We need to be sitting down with male and female and all the kind of intersectional variations of those two groups and sitting down with them and saying, okay, how can we help you as a victim? But we need to be doing the same with survivors. And there are no, as far as I'm aware, there are no widely known, accredited or government-funded female perpetrator programs in this country, which is insane when you consider that a lot of the research suggests parity of violence, and when the research suggests that half of relationships involve abuse by both parties.
If you're worried about a friend or a family member, here's some tips from Mark Brooks.
Well, firstly, you need to believe them, and you need to take them seriously. We talk about a 5-second test, that if you show, with respect to a male victim, any flicker of disbelief or try and downplay it, then the male victim will just clam up and won't disclose either to you again or may not disclose to anyone else. Secondly, you need to then reassure them that not only they are a victim, but also that you're on their side and that you can work together with them to actually find a solution to help them escape from the situation that they're in. That can include going to the police with them, that can include going to other organisations, and also helping them to find helplines and also local services. So believe them and then help them with practical support. In terms of if you're concerned, One of the things we recommend is looking at domestic abuse websites, including those for men, just to get some good background information. We recommend that because that's a really good starting point of actually trying to understand what is happening to someone you're concerned about. The second point is about just start dropping into the conversations or reaching out to them, and really do try and reach out to them. If you haven't heard from a brother or son or a mate for a year and they're in a new relationship, don't just shrug your shoulders and say, oh, he's got a new girlfriend or boyfriend and, they're in love, they don't want to talk to me or us anymore, they're doing their own thing. Make sure you're keeping in contact. But also, I think the key thing is that when you are in contact, just drop into the conversations. Is everything all right? Everything all right at home? Any particular issues that you're worried about, etc.? And they may well say, no, everything's all right, etc. And then you just say, well, if you ever want to talk about anything, just let me know, give me a call, etc. And then leave it. And they may not disclose to you and say anything for months, but what you're doing is that you're opening the door ajar that basically reassures them that actually you will listen to them and take them seriously if they want to open that door more widely. And that's the key thing, is that it's just about moving the door ajar bit by bit.
James has thankfully managed to move on from his abusive relationship. He's now happily married and surrounded by people who love and value him.
I've been very lucky. Amazing family, amazing friends, an incredible partner, as I say, a very supportive workplace that I owe a huge debt of gratitude to all of those people for bearing with me and helping me rebuild. But I think, again, that's the message that I would want to get across, that it can be done. It does take time, and separation is not some easy fix, because as a very wise counsellor that was working with the children early doors said to me at the close of one of their rounds of counselling, she said somebody who has had control will not go quietly. They will not relinquish that control quietly, and you are unlikely to have heard the last of your abuser. And sadly that has been the case, and there's been further police involvement and some very, very challenging behaviours to deal with. But as you rebuild and as you create a fresh life for yourself, that gets easier to deal with. And the support networks have got better. That same agency that didn't have support available to men a few years ago now does, and have provided me with some incredible support, and the assistance of a support worker, referrals through to mental health providers who are able to offer kind of bespoke counselling. So that support is out there. It can just, I think my message to people would be persevere. It isn't, there at the click of your fingers, but it is there. But it's a long journey, and the best thing is to surround yourself with as much support as you can and draw on that, and don't be afraid to ask for that help, because that's the message I had consistently from friends. You need to just ask. You need to stop being afraid to ask for help.
This is a sentiment also echoed by Mark Brooks.
There's lots of websites, there's national helplines, there's local services that you can reach out to actually get that help directly from them in your local community. And helplines like ours often provide a listening service where men just want to recognise and get things off their chest and understand that they are a victim, and then we would signpost them onto local services. So go to the police if you're in danger. Important to have a diary, log incidents, collect evidence, confide in trusted friends and family, and get information that's online. Contact your local domestic abuse service. There is support out there. And my overriding message is that there are thousands of men going through domestic abuse right now. There's also thousands of men who are starting the journey onto being in an abusive relationship. But there's also thousands of men all of the time who are leaving successfully abusive relationships.
You've been listening to the Problem with Men podcast. I want to say a huge thank you to James for bravely sharing his story with us, and to Mark and Ben for sharing their expertise on the subject. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a rating or review on your podcast player. It really does help us to get to a wider audience. And if you'd like more information on domestic abuse, we've put together some resources on our website, theproblemwithmen.co.uk. Until next time, goodbye.
The Problem with Men podcast is an Octopus Industries production. Produced and presented by Chris Dodd and produced by Sandra Kabasinguzi.